So we looked at spiritual leadership in business, spiritual leadership in education. How do you engage in the business realm, in the area of business, whereby you do not prioritize money, but you prioritize the engagement of your business partners and customers with Christ, with kingdom principles? Okay, their own interest. We looked at servant, motivation in dealing with, the people that you relate with. Then in education, how do we frame the minds of young peoples, okay, so that they will have deeper understanding of Christ, so that they will walk in kingdom principles, even though they have these degrees? How do they operate their degrees on Christian principles? That's what spiritual leadership in education entails. Now, spiritual leadership in healthcare. Remember, I said in education, you educate a doctor, a medical doctor, or a nurse on the basis of Christian leadership with the understanding of Christ, of servanthood, okay, that you are operating with Christian principles wherever you are, not because you are a doctor or a nurse or an engineer, no, but as a medical practitioner, once you enter into that space, what is paramount, what you prioritize is the principles of God, not your own personal, what do they call it again? The principles of that particular profession. Usually this kind of medical professions, before they enter into it, they take an oath, the oath of the medical doctor or the nurse. Now, your oath to Christ is higher than the oath of these professions. That means be a spiritual leader in healthcare. You have to carry your oath to Christ, your commitment to Jesus, higher both the oath of the nurse, both the oath of the doctor. The oath of the nurse and the doctor, they are very good, very positive oaths that are supposed to, engage with the care of the patient. But the spiritual leader must understand that the hospital, the medical care facility, is a spiritual battleground. Yes, it's a spiritual battleground. It's not just a physical place, whereby science rules. There are spiritual forces that rule in these places. Why? Because these places are where destinies are made. They are gates. This is where children come into the world, and this is where people go to the far beyond. Either go to heaven or to hell. So this is a place of transaction where a lot of forces converge, in order to try to control the destinies of people. So the mindset of the spiritual leader who is a Christian, in these particular spaces must be different from the secular person. You cannot engage with any of the things that you deal with in the medical profession with the mindset of an ordinary doctor. If you're a Christian, you have to engage, okay, as a spiritual leader. What is it that Jesus Christ, has, enjoined us to do? When we find ourselves in these places, when you meet somebody that is sick, you're not just going to jump, okay, into your medical profession, your knowledge as a medic. No, as a doctor, you know that, I know this person may be suffering from meningitis or so on and so forth. But apart from that, there are other forces at work. The force of grace, the force of mercy is also at work. You could find somebody that is suffering from a disease and is at the point of that medically this person is supposed to have given up. How about you leading this person to believe there are other solutions outside of the medical solution, the medical options that are available there? Laying of hands and praying. The Bible is very clear. He said, if anyone is sick among you, let the elders lay hands and anoint that person with oil. And then the prayer of faith will do what? Save that person, raise him up. So the medical doctor that is a spiritual leader, the nurse that is a spiritual, the pharmacist that is a spiritual leader, Okay, the lab technician, that is a spiritual leader, perceives the world around him in that medical environment through the prism of scripture, of kingdom principles, the prism of scripture and kingdom principles. And as such, they are able to have more effective leadership in these places than other people. Okay, they are able to uh, deal with situations more effectively. And you have other doctors that are not Christian or spiritual minded, handling cases, you know. And then when you come in, you see a solution immediately. By engaging in that situation, the solution is found. Why? Because you are bringing in spiritual leadership from a Christian standpoint, or Christian point of view. This is very, very important. Now, what about spiritual leadership in governance? We've looked at spiritual leadership in business, in education, in healthcare. What about governance? Now, governance is a place that is highly contestable, very, very, very contestable. Government, politics. How do you carry spiritual leadership into these areas? We've heard people encourage from the pulpit, men of God, encourage Christians, you need to go into politics so that you can change, you can bring Christian leadership into the political space, into the space of governance that is full of corruption. We can carry our light, the light that has been given to us, instead of hiding it under a bushel, we can carry it where darkness is so that it will bring light. If there is darkness of corruption in politics and governance, then the Christian should bring his light into that place. But very critical principle that we must pay attention to when we're dealing with spiritual leadership and governance is the fact that before you enter into governance, you must first of all be a spiritual leader. Remember, we defined what spiritual leadership is. Spiritual leadership, that capacity for you to motivate, to inspire, okay, to shift and move people towards an ethical goal, a goal that is kingdom based. So if you are not first of all a spiritual leader, you can't go into politics or into governance and then expect to lead spiritually there. So first of all, you must be a spiritual leader. So when we talk about people going into politics, people talking about Christians going into politics, there are Christians that are in politics, but they are not spiritual leaders. So they cannot lead spiritually. So that's the point that I need to make at the beginning. Okay, so that we understand the difference. A lot of complaints. People complain about Christians. Oh, this person was a Christian. He became the senator, became the governor, he became the vice president, became this and that and that, became the president, whatever. The question is, that person may be a Christian, but is he or her a spiritual leader? There are people who are Christians, but they are not spiritual leaders. So when they get into that particular secular environment, they can't lead spiritually. So the agenda of God suffers under those circumstances. But there are people we have seen, okay, whether vice president or senator, that are Christian leaders who are spiritual leaders, and they entered into that space and we saw a difference. Immediately we saw a difference. People were able to testify. People who are watching the spiritual environment able to testify that this person, is a Christian, and they entered into that space and there was a change. We could see things happening that benefited the people, because the whole point of leadership in governance is to look out for the advancement of the ordinary person, how the structure of governance can be used to advance the good, the common good of people, and create structures that are in place that will dissuade structural violence. Okay? Okay. So these are the basic fundamental tenets of what governance, Christian governance, are supposed to be pursuing. So you see people who find themselves in this place, they claim or call themselves nominally as Christians, but we do not see this advancement taking place in the lives of the common people or the common goal, as a whole. So you begin to doubt their veracity, the validity of their faith as Christians. So this is critical for us to understand. Yeah, being a Christian does not automatically mean that you are a spiritual leader. So first of all, these people must be built up as spiritual leaders before being pushed into the governance space in order for them to begin to lead spiritually. This is what is very, very important and very, very critical when we talk about spiritual leadership. So the church now has a responsibility. The church now has a responsibility when it comes to spiritual leadership in governance, what we call politics. The church now has a responsibility. And that responsibility is creating spiritual leaders. If we create spiritual leaders, then we can now send them into the political space, into the governance space, and then they can now be effective. But if we do not create spiritual leaders, then that space will not be able to be transformed. Give you a classical example. We had uh, 3 leaders that were created, apart from Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were princes in Israel during the captivity. But Daniel, was somebody who set himself apart. First of all, as a spiritual leader, he had been trained as a spiritual leader. So when he was taken into captivity in Babylon and he was brought into the presence of the king and, brought into the palace to begin to serve in capacity of governance, we can see that the principles by which he was raised as a spiritual leader, he immediately implemented. I cannot eat this, I cannot eat this, I cannot eat this. Is not for me. I live a separated life, a life that is separated unto God. And it is by reason of my separatedness that my governance principles emanate from. That's how Daniel began to engage. By the time he became prime minister, we can still see that it is his training as a spiritual leader that became, manifest in the space of political governance. It impacted on the people. It impacted even on the king himself. Okay? So we can see with scriptural example, somebody who is, first of all, trained as a spiritual leader and then sent into governance space. He does not compromise. He refused to come, even from food, from something as basic as food. Daniel refused to compromise. He refused to compromise when it comes to prayer time. He refused to compromise. So if somebody like that refuses to compromise over this, is it over a bribe that he will not compromise? No, he will not compromise. It's an indication of what is valuable, what is of priority to him. He will not compromise over those things. Why? Because he has been trained, he has been raised as a spiritual leader. So when the church talks about politics, are we training spiritual leaders to send them into the politics, into the space of governance? No, we're not training spiritual leaders. We're just sending people to their death because the place is a powerful place of struggle. It's a place where destinies are determined. People are committing all sorts of ritual sacrifices to fortify themselves with demonic powers. And then you are sending church members who have not been trained to be spiritual leaders into that space. They will be eaten up alive. That's the reason why many Christians go into politics and come back, with their faith shattered. They backsliding completely. Why? Because they went in not as spiritual leaders, spiritual warriors, people who have been trained for that battle space. They didn't go in like that. That's why they came out defeated They've lost their faith. They become of them. They become of the corruption. That is the responsibility of the church, to train spiritual leaders in order to send them into politics.